Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Allahumma la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Allahumma 'allimna ma yanfa'una wanfa'na bima tu'allimuna wazidna bifadlika min fadlika 'ilman wa ta'lima. Allahumma faqihna fid din wa 'allimna ta'wil. وصلى اللهم وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين وبعد. So we are continuing with where we left off with the last lesson. And what we spoke about related mostly to the qada and qadar of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the fact that the human being, his actions are created, and how that relates, meaning our ability for voluntary action, how that relates to the will and power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And inshallah, everything was clear. So after that, the Shaykh, he's going to speak of some other issues that also relate to the qada and qadar of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but here not directly relative to the creation of the actions of the slave, but indirectly related, in the sense that everything within the creation is according to the will and power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's a reinforcement of that point of aqidah. And we're going to see as we get into the detailed issues that the Shaykh mentioned. So without further ado, the Shaykh, rahimahullah, wa nafa'ana bi ulumihi ameen, he said, wal maqtulu mayyitun bi ajalih wal ajalu wahid. And that's very clear, very direct. The one who is killed, and that includes the one who was killed unlawfully, right, the victim of murder, is dead in his appointed time, his ajal. And the ajal, the appointed time, is one. And that statement is a refutation of the idea that the human being has, let's say, an original appointed time of his or her death, and then an appointed time wherein they will be killed. No. A person who was killed dies when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has willed that he or she will die. Now, the Shaykh mentions this issue and the next issue, which we will, of course, see, because there, again, there's a tension within not necessarily the mind, but the feelings, the emotions of the human being whenever dealing with adversity or dealing with negativity. And if you think back to previous lessons, we mentioned that the discourse, the theological discourse that we see Ahlus Sunnah engaging in, is mostly in dialogue with the Mu'tazila. And the Mu'tazila had a principle where they said that what is the best for the slave is required of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wujub al-aslah, the obligation of doing what is best or in the best interests of the slave. And you also see this mentioned in works of usul al-fiqh, particularly those works that follow the way of the jumhur, the overwhelming majority of the scholars, meaning non-Hanafis. It's also, as we've mentioned before, called tariqatul mutakallimin, the path of the theologians. This issue of al-husnu wal-qubhu al-aqliyan, having, and we'll loosely translate that as moral understandings, moral discernment that is based on reason. But it's literally al-husn wal-qubh, mean something that is good versus something that is repugnant, morally repugnant, and that goodness or ugliness, repugnance, is judged by the aql, by reason, okay? So based on that principle, rationally, there are things that we find that we have a natural inclination toward, a natural affinity toward, and there's things that we have a natural aversion to. So being killed is one of those things that is qabih, all right? And according to this misconception that the Mu'tazila had, they don't want to ascribe an ugly action or an ugly aspect of the creation to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right. So that's why this is an issue in the first place. You'll even hear that today with certain people. If somebody dies young, what is it that people say? That they're gone too soon, or gone before their time. I've heard this said just as a statement amongst the people culturally, and that's actually against the aqidah. All right, everyone who dies, including the one who is killed, including the one who is killed unjustly and unlawfully, that person has died in their time. And it's qabih from our rational understanding, meaning we have a natural aversion to it, but that natural aversion does not negate that it is still an event that is absolutely subjugated by the will and power of Allah. And that's the reason, the ultimate cause of why it occurred. Then the Sheikh, as we said, he goes on to another issue also, again, related to this idea. Wal haramu rizq. Wa kullun yastawfi rizqa nafsihi halalan kana aw haraman. Wa la yutasawwaru an la ya'kula insanun rizqah aw ya'kula ghayruhu rizqah. So again, elaborating on this idea, the prohibited is sustenance, it is provision. Al-haramu rizq, meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is ar-razzaq for every creature in existence. And when it comes to human beings, even if that individual has earned his provision in an impermissible way, that provision is still written as his provision. All right, and that's clear. But the Sheikh comes with these explicit declarations just to, again, reiterate the fact that everything is according to the decree and predetermined measure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he goes on to elaborate a little bit more. And every person will exhaust the provision of his self, meaning his what is personally written as his rizq, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with Allah, then an individual will not pass away. That appointed time for that individual's death does not come until he or she has used up all of the rizq that was written for him or her. Whether that risk be what? Halalan kana aw haraman. Whether it is permissible or prohibited. And it is not conceivable that that a human being Allah ya'kula insanun rizqa. It's inconceivable that a human being does not consume his provision, or ya'kula ghayruhu rizqa, or that another consumes his provision. All right. And that statement is clear, inshallah. And then the Sheikh goes on. Wallahu ta'ala yudillu man yasha'u wa yahdi man yasha'. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he misguides whoever he wills, and he guides whoever he wills. And of course, there are reasons for the misguidance or guidance of a person according to the hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But both dalala and hidayah are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the Shaykh continues, وَمَا هُوَ الْأَصْلَحُ لِلْعَبْدِ فَلَيْسَ ذَلِكَ بِوَاجِبٍ عَلَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. And what is in the best interest of the slave, that is not an obligation for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here the Shaykh wraps up the general principle of the detailed issues that he points out in the previous sentences. All right. So overall, the gist of everything that we've read today, and inshallah, it's easy, is that nothing is obligatory upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Despite what we might think about it, despite the way that we might feel about it. And as we said, the ulama, they have spoken of this issue under the title of al-husnu wal-qubhu al-aqliyan. Good, a rational good versus rational bad. Again, literally repugnant. And to what extent the human being can make judgments in that regard, moral judgments, using the intellect, using rational discernment. And in Western philosophy, this is akin to what's called natural law. All right. But that's how the ulama frame it. And one of the most brilliant discussions of this issue is by Imam al-Ghazali, Hujjat al-Islam, rahimahullah, in al-Iqtisadu fil i'tiqad. Something that I, from the moment I read it up until now, that I've appreciated very deeply. Imam al-Ghazali really has a way of communicating himself that made him a master teacher. So I'm just going to go through some of the points that were made by al-Ghazali, and this is, of course, representative of the position of Ahlul Sunnah in this regard. And again, you can find this also discussed in some books of usul al-fiqh. So when we talk about al-husn wal-qubh, what that means specifically For Ahlul Sunnah, it can be divided. And there's agreement and there's disagreement based on the perspective that an individual may be coming from. So when it comes to the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we affirm that what is good or bad rationally does not have to fit within the framework of the Sharia. All right? Because good and bad, if you will, morality in the Sharia is what? It's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, if we're speaking about good, praised in the dunya, something that is praiseworthy with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, mahmud, or you can say there's a madh, also a praise or a lauding that's attached to it in the dunya, all right, fil ajil, and in the akhirah, right, al-ajil, there is a reward for that thing. That's what good really is, all right? And the opposite is the case with al-qabih, with the ugly, literally, or the bad. Something that is bad in Shar'i terms is something that is that has a them, a blame or a censure that is attached to it in the immediate world that we're in now, and something that has an iqab, or the threat of iqab, of punishment in the akhirah. All right? And inshallah, that's clear. That's what good and bad, morally speaking, is when it comes to the Sharia. All right? It's based on revelation. It's based on revelation without any regard or reference to the intellect. And not only that, but it cannot be known by means of reason. All right? This is something that is beyond the scope of the aql, right? And that's very important. That's the position of Ahlul Sunnah in contradistinction to the position of the Mu'tazila, because for them, there's a connection, all right, between reason and then the ahkam that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has legislated, or why those things are legislated. Now, again, when we talk about good or bad, rationally speaking, what is that in reference to? It's in reference to, in terms of good, those things for which we have a natural leaning or inclination toward, a natural liking of, all right? And the bad is the opposite of that. Those things where we have an innate aversion to, okay? So if I said I have this this water in front of me, and if I'm thirsty, I'm going to drink this water. I'm going to go ahead and take a swig. Bismillah. This water is good to me. It's refreshing. It quenches my thirst. So this water is hasan. That act of drinking water is hasan aqlan, because it agrees with me. It agrees with my self-interest naturally, okay? But if this was a bottle full of poison, or if this water was poisoned and I knew it was poisoned, I'm not going to open it up and take a swig. It's bad for me, all right? It's qabih. It's qabih. Why? Because I innately have an aversion to anything that's going to cause me harm, all right? So again, when we talk about morality from a rational perspective, it's related to, as we just pointed to, the rational discernment of benefits versus harm within the self-interest of the subject. Okay, so is everything clear so far, inshallah? So we agree with the Mu'tazila and others with that understanding of the rational discernment of good and bad, but we understand that the scope of that is simply the self-interest of the human being. All right, as it relates to his either real or perceived benefits or harms. Okay, so there's agreement on that. All right, our issue is what? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not obligated rationally, and definitely not in terms of the Sharia, to legislate or do what is in our perceived, or real or perceived self-interest, our benefit. Okay, and what Al-Ghazali mentions that I really appreciate so much is we have to understand the meaning of wujub. If we say something is wajib ala Allah, we need to understand what it means for something to be necessary or an obligation. So what is wujub? And when we understand wujub, we can have a clear understanding of how wujub cannot apply to the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So wujub, if you reflect on it, it means that if a person does not do a thing, if he leaves an action, then the leaving off of that action will result in harm. There is a harmful consequence related to the leaving of an action, to not doing something. Okay? So to give another example with our bottle of water here, let's say I'm severely dehydrated and my body is in dire need of water. If I do not drink, then that will result in harm to my person. Okay, I will be doing damage to my body. So in a situation like that, we would say what? It's wajib for me to drink water. Why? Because there's a harm that would be entailed by not doing so. Okay. You can even say, you can see this, excuse me, you can see this, this understanding of wajib as it relates even in the definition of wujub in usul al-fiqh, right? What does it mean for an action in the Sharia to be wajib? All right. One side of it is that what? If it's not done, then the individual who abandons that action is liable to punishment, all right, which is a harm, a darar. Okay, so that's easy to understand. The idea of wajib, our understanding of wajib, whether it be religiously speaking or even in the dunya, even amongst non-Muslims, is that what? If it's not done, it entails some type of harm as a consequence. Okay, so I have to do this in order to avert this harm. All right. Now, can that understanding of wajib apply to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? No, it cannot. Why? If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses not to do something, even if that thing is something that we might have a natural liking for, something that is of benefit to us as the slaves, what type of harm could possibly result with Allah not doing something, subhanahu wa ta'ala? Nothing, because nothing can harm Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the idea of wujub from the outset, based on the, the foundation of the very meaning of obligation or necessity, it cannot, in principle, it cannot apply to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because harm to Allah is inconceivable. All right. So there can be no consequence to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not doing something. All right. Therefore, nothing is obligatory for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, when you put it in those terms where everything is clearly defined, it's very easy to understand. But this is a point that many have slipped on, all right, including the Mu'tazila. There's a confusion, and really it's a type of tashbih, all right, a type of resembling Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the creation when we start to think of the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that way. All right. So even though the Mu'tazila, they have a reputation because of their denial of the attributes of going to a misconception of tanzih, all right, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala transcending any likeness to the creation. At the same time, we find them doing tashbih when it comes to the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is something that is mentioned in a number of different works in Aqidah. But one of the beautiful discussions of this is broken down in the Hashya of at-Dusuqi on Sharh al-Barahin, where he goes into these, actually, as-Sunusi himself, rahimahullah, lists these 10 ways in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have any likeness to the creation. And it's in the af'al that he mentions this as well. So it's very important to understand this. We make these affirmations about nothing being obligatory for Allah based on our understanding that there's no mumathala and no mushabaha with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of his actions. All right. So the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are not related to any aghrad. There's no aghrad, term that ulama use, which is the plural of gharad, which means some type of self-interest or something that's going to motivate him to do something in order to achieve something else. All right. There's hikmah, but there's no gharad. And those are two different distinct meanings. Okay. So when you think about the depth of this meaning, it's so important, it really can't be overstated. What is one of the issues amongst other issues with Christianity in terms of their aqidah, that Isa alayhi salam had to die in order to produce or bring about the salvation of humanity? Can you see what that aqidah entails? It's exactly the same issue that we're talking about here. All right. Making something required of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based on this false understanding of the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right. First, they say that what, and I've actually had a discussion with Christians on this very issue. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not punish sin, it would be unjust. All right. So from the very outset, they are affirming that injustice is conceivable for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right. Now, what's the problem with that? It's that injustice or doing wrong, dhulm, only applies when someone is acting with something that does not belong to them, or they are in violation of some higher law. All right. But the question is, everything belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he can do whatever he wills with his property. And then on top of that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the source of all law. He is the shari'. So there can't be, any command, any amr that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is subject to and that he could disobey or be in violation of. You see? So it's inconceivable that understanding can apply to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a tashbih. All right. So what is it that they say? Isa alayhi salam is sacrificed for the sake of the salvation of humanity in order to satisfy this principle of justice, of people deserving to be punished for their sins, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot simply forgive and let people go if he willed, but there must be punishment. And in order for that to be fulfilled, this death of Isa alayhi salam had to take place in order for Allah to accomplish the salvation of humanity. It's kufrun shani'. It is a reprehensible statement of kufr, of disbelief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you think of it in the correct terms, which is the terms of Ahlul Sunnah. All right. But it all goes back to this idea of not distinguishing between the actions of the creation versus the actions of Allah, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is munazzah, not just in his that, not just in his sifat, but also in his af'al, his actions. And there can be no wujub upon him. All right. So was everything that we mentioned today clear, inshallah? This was a shorter lesson, but the Sheikh got straight to the point. And next lesson we'll be getting into a different topic, inshallah. Were there any questions or comments? طيب. If everything is good, then inshallah we will see you on the next one. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wa iyyakum. Wassalamu alaikum.